Hi. This is Moog's SUBSEQUENT 25. It's an update to their analog monophonic sub-fatty, now with 2-note paraphonic support and an updated sound engine. Unlike many analog monosynths, Sub-25 can store presets and be digitally controlled, which means a few extra benefits which we'll take a look at. I'll also explore some patch ideas. Let's get started. One of the biggest new features in Sub-25 is its duophonic or 2-note paraphonic mode, which lets you play 2 different notes using the onboard keyboard or using an external one. If you hit one note, both oscillators will play it, but the minute you add a second note, each oscillator will play a different note based on your preference of which oscillator you'd like to get the high note and which the lower one. Once you leave a note, both will snap back to the same note. Playing paraphonically means that both notes share the same filter and amp envelope, though I'll show you a few ways around this limitation in the patch ideas section later on in the video. The second change in Sub-25 compared to Sub-fatty is its sound engine, the filter section in particular. I don't have a Sub-fatty around to compare, but we'll take a listen to the filter soon enough. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the synth overall. And overall, the build is quite sturdy. It's a heavy little synth with wood cheeks, metal front and back. The keybed seems high quality, though it only has 2 octaves. The keyboard is velocity sensitive, but doesn't have aftertouch. The knobs and interface feel great. All in all, it feels like a very roadworthy synth. The tilted panel is always preferred and more convenient when you use it, though it's not adjustable, so you'll need a bigger case and some padding to take it on the road. Thankfully, the power supply is built in, so that's one less power adapter to worry about. The synth has many features that are accessible on the panel and quite a few additional ones that are accessible with shortcuts, MIDI control, or the companion software. The core sound engine of Sub-25 includes 2 multi-shape morphing oscillators with another square sub-oscillator, a multi-slope Moog filter with a very characterful pre- and post-filter drive feature, 2 envelopes, and a single LFO. While Sub-25's signal path is fully analog, everything is digitally controlled, which lets it store presets, and you can store 16 presets on board in 4 banks of 4 presets each. And you can store as many additional presets as you like in the companion software. So if you have a computer nearby, you have access to an unlimited number of presets. In terms of connectivity, it has 5-pin MIDI in, out, and MIDI over USB, monophonic audio out, as well as external audio in, and inputs for CV control over filter, pitch, and amp, as well as a gate signal input. Finally, for the overview, since this is a synth with presets, the knobs will almost never represent actual parameter values unless you hit the panel, the activate panel button, in which case it will. So if while you're watching this, something doesn't quite add up in terms of knob positions, it's probably because the internal parameter is pointing to something different than the actual knob position. Before I go into the details of Sub-25's functionality, we need to discuss the shift and hidden features because they add important functionality to any module we discuss, so this will come up pretty often. The companion software, which works both standalone and as a plugin for your DAW, shows this best. You can see that the top part of the panel, the top part of the plugin, gives you pretty much the same controls as the synth, and these controls are certainly a good place for beginners to start. But when you expand the panel down, you can see that there's serious additional sound design power that gets revealed. You don't have to use the software though to modify these additional synth parameters. You can access all this functionality either by mapping a MIDI controller to the elements that you want to control, and another option is to use the shift functions or the hidden parameter controls. Let's take, for example, the way you control the level of the audio coming in through the external input, or if nothing's plugged in, the level of the internal feedback. You can do that by either using the on-screen parameter here. Okay, this is the feedback control. Using a shift function, which in this case you get to by getting into shift mode and then turning the noise knob. Or in this case, I mapped this knob in this controller to control external level. Just crank it up like this. Which is obviously very convenient. Some of the parameters are a little bit more tricky. So for example, the filter slope is adjustable. By default, it's 24 dB per octave. Again, I can use the plugin to change that to 18 dB per octave, 12 or 6 dB. The shift combo for this is a little bit more difficult. You go into shift mode and then light up these two buttons. And then these keys are what you use to change the number of poles. So I can only do this a number of times. So I'll do that again. Let's hear a note. 4 pole. Let's move it down to 1 pole. And then the third way is obviously with MIDI control. Let's just bring in a little bit more oomph to show you how impactful this is. So this is the 1 pole, 2, 3, and 4. And again, down to 1. So if you're a beginner, yes, the panel is a great way to start and learn about synthesis, but to make the most out of this synth, either be ready to use the companion software, learn the shortcuts, or use an external MIDI controller. Okay, so let's dive into the details. I think the main star of the show is the filter and the way that it was updated. This is a classic Moog filter here in 4-pole or 24 dB per octave mode without resonance. Very nice. As expected, bringing in resonance will reduce the bass. And the more we bring it in, the more dominant it becomes. And it will self-oscillate. Crank it all the way up. Now this is nice, but where it gets interesting and different from your typical Moog is the poles, which we went through very briefly before, but they do change the character of the filter quite a bit. You can see they make it more aggressive as they let more harmonics in. So this is 6 dB, 12 dB, 18, and then back to 24. And I think the big deal here beyond that is the multi-drive circuit. Which changes the character of the sound a lot more. Almost sounds like a different synth altogether. And I think combined with the external input feedback, it can get even crazier. The character of this filter is obviously very much Moog, but engaging multi-drive takes it way out of Kansas or Asheville in this case, giving it an exceedingly distorted character. Aside from this, you have two more controls on the panel: envelope generator amount and it's bipolar. And keyboard amount, which lets the filter cutoff frequency track the notes you play up and down the keyboard. And this goes all the way from 0 tracking, and I'll have the filter self-oscillate here, all the way to 1 which lets you play up and down the keyboard, to 200%. And that's pretty much the filter. Let's move on to the oscillators. You've got 2 of them, as well as a sub-oscillator. You've got mixer control over the level of each of the 2 oscillators and sub-oscillator. Each of the oscillators can transpose over a 4-octave range, and they're both identical in the wave shapes they have. They go all the way from triangle, let's just get levels up a bit, morphing into saw, morphing into square, and morphing into a narrow pulse. Like I mentioned, both oscillators have these controls. Oscillator 2 also has a fine-tuning option which transposes very nicely 7 semitones up or 7 semitones down. And then the sub-oscillator is a square wave, 1 octave below oscillator 1, so it moves along with it. The waveform isn't just continuous, it's also a mod destination for the LFO, so I can increase the mod amount to the wave using this knob, increase the overall mod depth like this, and get both pulse width modulation, which sounds pretty massive here, but also morphing between different shapes, so I could morph, say, between a triangle and a saw as well. Including rhythmic options going through 0. Yeah, the pulse width modulation here is so massive, especially with the sub, that you can easily free up oscillator 2 to play somewhere higher duophonically. So if I turn on duophonic mode, and again I can do this through the software, through shortcuts, or using an external controller, then I can have oscillator 1 play here. Let's turn on oscillator 2 and yeah, have it play something else much higher. I mentioned this before, oscillator 2 also has a handy hard sync function. The more harmonically rich waveform it has, the better it sounds. So this is a triangle, not too great, but this is sawtooth hard sync, and then a square pulse. On the hidden features side, Sub 25 has a beat frequency fine-tune control. So if you detune the oscillators using the semitone frequency control, then this beat frequency will change as you play up and down the keyboard. It'll slow down as you play lower. If you want this beat frequency to be consistent as you play up and down the keyboard, just tune the oscillators as much as possible to each other, then crank up the beat frequency. And then the rhythm or the beating of the oscillators against each other should stay much more consistent as you play up and down the keyboard. Another nice little hidden feature is the oscillator gate reset. So typically the oscillators are phasing in and out of each other. And you see how they're slightly different from each other? Especially if I stay quiet. You can have them reset when you hit a key, and they'll stay consistently punchy and won't change, as opposed to where they don't always have this hard gate reset attack. Let's move on to the mixer section. This lets you control the level of the two main oscillators, the sub oscillator, the noise generator, and remember the external input as well. The knobs go up to 12, hinting at the fact that beyond a certain level, they'll start to amplify and slightly distort the signal, pushing it into the filter. And indeed, this happens beyond 6. And this is quite evident in conjunction with the drive. We didn't give noise much attention, so let's just listen to it. Pinkish noise, nice for adding grit to your sound, making percussive sounds. Or if you haven't had quite enough storms and wind this winter. Let's move on to the envelopes. Sub 25 has two of them, seemingly on the surface ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release envelopes for the filter cutoff and for the amplifier for the level of your sound over time. Both envelopes have additional hidden functions. You tab between the two using this button here. They've got a delay stage, a stage before the attack stage of the envelope, and a hold stage, which is between the attack and the decay. You've got easy controls to add velocity sensitivity to your sound. You've got multi-trig control when you play legato, and I think the most interesting feature about these envelopes is the repeat function. This essentially turns both of them into an LFO, so if I turn on repeat for the amp envelope, it goes well into audio rates, but even just does cool things like this. It turns your sound into a rhythmic sound. Freeing up the LFO to do something else, not to mention the fact that the amp level isn't a destination for the LFO at all. Together with the delay and hold parameters, this really gives you control over shapes in ways that you just don't get with the LFO. So this is pretty cool. And this repeat functionality works for the filter envelope as well, of course. So now that we talked about the two hidden LFOs, let's talk about the main and real one on the panel. Sub 25's LFO has a few shapes that are available here and three destinations. The wave shape, we saw that before with pulse width modulation, the filter cutoff, and the pitch either of both oscillators or just oscillator 2. That's especially useful if you've got hard sync on. Let's just listen briefly to the different LFO shapes played on the filter cutoff. All of the modulation sources here go through the mod wheel, so I can crank this up as much as I want. If I don't bring up the mod wheel, we won't hear it. So this is a triangle LFO, square, with variable mod depth, saw, ramp, random or sample and hold. And you can also cut the LFO out of the modulation chain and bring in the filter envelope. This is useful because you may want to send the filter envelope either to pitch or to the wave shape. Let's just talk about a few of the hidden features of the LFO. You can choose, just like you can point the LFO only to oscillator 2 if you like, you can also choose to point the wave modulation to either oscillator 1 or oscillator 2, or both if you like. You've got two additional LFO ranges. So the normal range is between 0.1 Hertz, which is very slow, to about 100 Hertz, but you can move into the high rates, which goes into 1000 Hertz. Nice for FM style sounds, or to extremely low rates, in which case this is the highest rate, and then I think it's 0.01 Hertz. You can have the LFO accelerate as you play up and down the keyboard. Also nice for FM. I'll show you this later in the patch ideas section. You can have the LFO be free running or have it reset every time you hit a key. which is nice for consistency. And something which you don't find in every analog synth, you can also sync the LFO to MIDI. So if it doesn't get any incoming MIDI, then you just have a free running LFO with free control over rate. But if I send in a beat, then the LFO will sync to the incoming tempo, including dotted and triplet values. So that's the LFO. It skips between the shapes, as you can hear. If you want continuous morphing, you can always use the envelopes in LFO mode. Okay, let's move on and take a quick look at the companion librarian and control app. It works both standalone and as a plugin, both on Mac and on PC. And aside from giving you direct control over pretty much every parameter, it also has a preset librarian, so you're not limited to just 16 presets. The app, by the way, is bi-directional, so any change that you make on the app will impact the synth, and any change you make on the synth is visible in the app as well. It's also a great learning tool. Obviously, the knobs don't move or change as you change presets, but they do on the app, so you can get a very good idea of what's going on in a preset just by looking at the app. The app also gives you access to preferences. There are keyboard combinations for I think all of these, but it's much more pleasant to change these using the app, and it also has a randomize feature. Sometimes you hear something and sometimes you don't. Whoa. So if you're feeling adventurous, randomize your preset and see what happens. Like I said, sometimes nothing. And sometimes interesting things. Aside from using Sub-25 as a synth, the keyboard and all the knobs all send out MIDI information, which means you can use it as a controller next to your computer. Okay, let's talk about some patch ideas. You can easily create two-note chords by bringing in both oscillators and changing the pitch interval between them and the octave intervals. So that's a great way to create interesting two-note chords. However, using the filter cutoff tracking at a 1-to-1 ratio with a little bit of resonance, you can either create your own tone with a self-oscillating filter or just emphasize different harmonics in your sounds to create three-note chords. So this is my two-note chord, and I can bring in resonance. Just pick off a harmonic if I wanted. Okay, this is the chord without it. And this is with it. And this is just an emphasized harmonic, tracking very nicely with the keyboard. And if I wasn't willing to settle just for harmonics, I could obviously bring up resonance a little bit more, have it self-oscillate, and just pick any other gritty interval I wanted. Nice way to create interesting three-note chords. If you're into FM style sounds, another nice little tracking option in Sub-25 is the hidden feature which lets your keyboard track the LFO in a 1-to-1 relationship. So typically applying pitch modulation to an oscillator in an analog synth doesn't end up sounding very well. But if you find the right parameters and set the LFO amount to 1-to-1, you can get bell-like sounds that track well across the keyboard. Let's get back to a basic patch. So 2 octaves is not a lot for a monophonic synth. Certainly for a duophonic synth, it doesn't leave much wiggle room either. So I can put Sub-25 into duo mode and play 2 notes at a time. But again, with 2 octaves, I don't get much wiggle room. However, a special unique quirk of paraphonic modes, unlike true polyphonic synths where the oscillators always track together, here you can spread them apart and play a really low note with both when you hit one, but when you play two notes, maybe went too much to an extreme here, play a much higher note with oscillator 2, even though the interval that I'm actually playing on the keyboard is a pretty small one. So just two fingers in what would otherwise be a very narrow range can be extended quite a bit. Another nice workaround for the duophonic mode. So one of the problems of duophonic or paraphonic synths is that they share the same amp envelope and filter envelope. So the two notes pretty much sound the same. However, since our filter has such a sharp slope, I can put a little LFO on it and then bring that LFO in so that it only impacts the high note and doesn't impact the bass note much. So I can have a steady bass playing with my left finger and quite a different evolving and rhythmic timbre with my right finger. Another way to get different timbres for each of the notes is obviously to change or modulate their wave shape. And remember the hidden feature that lets me apply the LFO to just one of the oscillators. So I could have the wave shape of oscillator 1 rock solid and modulate the wave shape of oscillator 2. Let's move on to another neat little trick. Subsequent 25 unfortunately doesn't have a built-in arpeggiator. However, you can enter shift mode and then turn local off. Okay, so the keyboard no longer sends any notes to the synth engine, but it's still sending notes to my computer nearby. And I happened to have prepared here a little arpeggiator plugin, which takes MIDI coming out of the subsequent 25 and then sends it back, but I put a handy little arpeggiator MIDI effect in the middle, and if I turn this on, I have an arpeggiator. I can also hit hold, and we now have an arpeggiator. Little trick. If I move my LFO into gate mode, meaning that it will re-trigger every time I hit a key, then just choose a really slow rate, and I don't want it to track, which is okay. Then choose a slow rate here. I basically turned my LFO into an envelope that'll trigger with every key that I press. Now, if I move it to sample and hold, then basically I've turned the LFO into a random number generator that can impact any one of the parameters that the LFO can impact. So let's take a look at this, say just for the filter cutoff. Put filter amount all the way up. So now every time I press a key, a different random number will be sent to the filter cutoff. Let's bring resonance up. And I can choose a different mod depth if I wanted. Let's pick oscillator sync for this. This is just pitch to oscillator sync, randomly changing every note. Let's add filter to it. Wave them out, why not? Anyway, just a neat little effect, I think. Okay, let's take a look at the pros and cons. On the cons side, I would probably say my top three are the fact that there's only a 2-octave keyboard, the lack of an arpeggiator and sequencer, along with the fact that the hidden features are difficult to access and aren't even marked on the panel at all. Now, it's pretty obvious that to accommodate all these additional features, you'd need a bigger and more expensive synth, which is against the point of the Sub 25, and guess what? Indeed, if you add more knobs, an arpeggiator and sequencer and a few more keys, well, you get a Moog Sub 37, which indeed costs more and takes up more space. Which I guess brings me to the pros of Sub 25. It's a compact synth with many of the features of its bigger brother, all of its sound that doesn't take up much space next to a computer or within the context of a larger setup and doesn't cost as much. Now, it's not like there aren't more cons. I would have liked to have more modulation sources and destinations, which the Sub 37 does, by the way. It would also be nice to get more than just 16 onboard presets. Again, Sub 37 has that as well, though if you have the companion software nearby, it's almost a non-issue. Another pro for Sub 25, we saw this before, the ability to save presets and to tempo sync an LFO isn't something you see on any analog synth. So if you want plenty of Moog sound in a compact form factor, either next to a computer or as part of a bigger hardware setup, SUBSEQUENT 25 is a great way to go. The panel layout is excellent, the multi-drive really sets this synth apart, and the duophonic mode is a nice touch with a very unique character. And if you want plenty of ideas on what to do with all these knobs, both hidden and not, please check out my ever-expanding book available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if you found this useful, ring the bell after subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next one. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.